Fusion. At the heart of the sun, pressures and temperatures force hydrogen atoms to fuse together, forming heavier elements and releasing vast amounts of energy. All life on Earth depends on this thermonuclear reaction. We call it sunlight. But what if these cosmic forces could be recreated by man? Suppose, on the surface of the Earth, you could ignite a miniature star. The father of the hydrogen bomb received his earliest training under the eminent German physicist Werner Heisenberg. But almost before his career began, young Edward Teller became one of many Jewish scientists forced to flee Hitler's oppression. Most assumed professorships in American universities, where they helped create the first generation of classically trained physicists in the New World. Meanwhile, back in their former homelands, astonishing events were taking place. December 1938. In a small German laboratory, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann perform a simple, elegant experiment. Physicists had known for years that the heaviest naturally occurring element, uranium, throws off subatomic particles called neutrons. Hahn and Strassmann's experiment revealed those free neutrons as they split neighboring atomic nuclei, a process called fission. Each time a neutron split an atom, it released a burst of energy and more neutrons, which flew off to split more atoms. If you could rapidly assemble a large enough quantity of fissionable material, a critical mass, the resulting chain reaction could vaporize a small city.
The world changed for a very few far-sighted scientists, one of them being Leo Szilard, and he realized that this would change the whole nature of warfare. He probably realized it could change a lot of peaceful things too.
Szilard agonized over what to do. The Nazis were arming for war. President Roosevelt had to be warned. Fearing that such highly technical matters might not be taken seriously, Szilard decided to approach the one scientist too famous to ignore, Albert Einstein.
Szilard was an urbanite who lived in hotels and ate out of delicatessens. He, not surprisingly, didn't know how to drive. So he drafted Edward Teller, young Dr. Teller, to drive him out to Einstein's summer cottage on Long Island.
He needed a chauffeur. I drove a car. That was the beginning.
Szilard and Einstein co-wrote a letter urging President Roosevelt to answer the threat of a German bomb by underwriting an American atomic research program. But even with Einstein's endorsement, the matter was put over for further study. 2 more years would pass before the first scientists were recruited for the project. The very next day, America entered the war. Physicists at universities throughout America were invited to explore the feasibility of what came to be called the Manhattan Project. Hidden beneath the stadium bleachers at the University of Chicago, Enrico Fermi used graphite and raw uranium to construct the world's first nuclear reactor. As a worker stood by with an axe ready to cut the rope and drop control rods that would shut down the reaction in case of a runaway, Fermi initiated the experiment. Needles twitched in their dials. The chain reaction had begun, erasing all doubts. Nuclear weapons were indeed possible. Army General Leslie R. Groves, the man who'd built the Pentagon, was assigned to head the new project. As his lab director, Groves selected theoretical physicist Robert Oppenheimer, a controversial choice given Oppenheimer's well-known leftist leanings. But Groves liked the young Berkeley professor, so despite the FBI's concerns, the appointment was grudgingly approved.
Well, Groves had a good deal of science, but he was basically an engineer. So Oppenheimer became his kind of translator, someone who could, when Groves asked him a question, give him a clear answer. So in that sense, they were a perfect team. They were a buddy movie, if you will.
Oppenheimer turned out to be the perfect choice, with a profound sense of what the project could ultimately mean to the world. His ability to recruit and motivate his fellow scientists became the stuff of legend.
He would walk them out onto the campus, and he would say, I can't tell you what we'll be doing, but I can tell you that we could probably, as a result of this work, end the war, meaning the Second World War, and maybe end all war. And that was pretty big stuff for young faculty people.
Oppenheimer suggested a site not far from his vacation home, a sprawling ranch housing the Los Alamos Boys School, tucked away on an almost inaccessible mesa in New Mexico.
They had a mailbox, a post office box, that was their address, and that appears even on the birth certificates of children who were born there during the war.
The Manhattan Project called for engineering on a vast scale. In Tennessee, the largest buildings in the world were constructed to house miles of cascades and centrifuges, each one capable of producing only microscopic quantities of enriched uranium for the new weapons. In Washington State, Fermi's reactor was increased in size 1,000-fold to churn out the new, even more highly reactive element, plutonium. Within its 3-year deadline, the Manhattan Project would grow to become the largest industrial operation in history. Under General Grove's orders to prevent soldiers and technicians knowing what they were working on, no scientist at Los Alamos ever referred to the bomb. They called it the gadget. At an early conference, Enrico Fermi approached Edward Teller with an intriguing conjecture. If conditions in an atomic detonation mimic those at a star's core, could they also force hydrogen atoms to fuse? The result would be a superbomb. In theory, the destructive power of such a weapon would have no upper limit. Teller was intrigued almost to the point of obsession. While his colleagues struggled to perfect the fission bomb, Oppenheimer approved Teller's request to focus exclusively on the fusion bomb. The atomic bomb was nearly ready to test. Even as the war was winding down, the weapon that would change the world was about to be born. Jornada del Muerto, the journey of death. The men who designed the first atomic bomb raced to complete the job. If they're right, this clunky hand-built device will melt desert sand and turn night into day, rendering every previous weapon of war obsolete in a few millionths of a second. The clouds parted shortly before dawn. Scientists, soldiers, and VIPs moved to their observation posts, some of them more than 20 miles from ground zero. Edward Teller passed out suntan lotion to protect against the ultraviolet radiation. At 5:31 a.m., a mechanical timer in the command bunker clicked at the end of its track. 6 miles away, the firing circuits closed. Capacitors discharged, and 32 critically positioned detonators fired as one. The shock wave from the shaped charges rocketed inward, compressing the plutonium sphere to half its former size and turning it into a superdense liquid before finally crushing the beryllium initiator at its core, releasing a flood of neutrons. The chain reaction developed gradually. More than 80 generations of atomic nuclei had to fission before enough energy was released to crack the bomb casing. The entire process took nearly 8 millionths of a second. It only seemed instantaneous.
There was a strong feeling. What next? It will be much more to the fireball.
Germany had surrendered, and upon inspection, the Allies found no signs of an active atomic bomb program. But the war with Japan raged on. With their Navy, Air Force, and largest cities in ruins, the Japanese military refused to give up. President Harry S. Truman, in office barely 3 months, faced a horrifying choice.
Jimmy Burns, who was Secretary of State, sat Truman down and said, "Mr. President, what will you tell the American people at your impeachment in 1946 when they find out that you didn't use a powerful and decisive weapon that might have shortened the war and saved American lives? What will you tell them?" And the issue was, in that sense, a domestic issue, whether or not we used these weapons.
Manhattan Project scientists were equally torn. Wouldn't it make more sense to mount a demonstration? Or at least issue a warning before dropping such a weapon on a civilian population? Petitions circulated, including one that Edward Teller considered signing. Robert Oppenheimer told him it was the job of politicians, not scientists, to make policy.
That's a difficult moment to deal with because I don't think of Oppenheimer as being a deliberately dishonest person, but what he said then was not really thought through, and part of his motives were to stop this meddlesome fellow Teller standing between this dazzling project to which Oppenheimer had devoted everything he had and the obvious, and I have to say desired culmination, which was to use this weapon as a weapon.
Unlike the Fat Man plutonium bomb, the much simpler Hiroshima weapon, nicknamed Little Boy, couldn't be tested in advance. 3 years of full-time effort had purified barely enough uranium to fuel a single bomb. Oppenheimer's team was confident Little Boy would work. The basic design was inefficient but reliable enough. In fact, if all 65 kilograms of U-235 fissioned at once, the explosive force would exceed 1 million tons of TNT. The actual yield of the blast was closer to 13,000 tons. Less than 2% of the uranium, a mass about the size of a stick of gum, fissioned before the mechanism blew itself apart. But it was enough.
I could clearly see the city of Hiroshima within my bomb sight. When I felt the bump of the airplane, I was greatly relieved because I knew the unit had gone from the airplane. We saw this cloud of boiling dust and debris below us with this tremendous mushroom on top. Beneath that was hidden the ruins of the city of Hiroshima.
We were very satisfied by Hiroshima because we were sure it would end the Japanese war. And that was a great thing to do. There was a general celebration. Some celebration was justified. I did not wholeheartedly participate.
At first, the Japanese didn't know what hit them. Communication with Hiroshima was cut off. Rumors spoke of lightning flashes that had engulfed the city in flames. The Americans waited for a message from the Japanese high command. None arrived. 3 days later, an implosion bomb, the same type tested in New Mexico, was detonated over Nagasaki, the only target that had clear enough weather that morning. There was no need for a third strike. The war was over. America was now a global power with a monopoly on the most destructive weapon in history. The Los Alamos scientists began drifting back to their classrooms. Edward Teller assumed a professorship in Chicago. There might be no need for his superbomb after all. But despite security precautions, Soviet spies had infiltrated Los Alamos, and the plans they sent home were now fueling Joseph Stalin's own A-bomb project. The American monopoly on nuclear weapons was Europe's guarantee of security, and that guarantee was about to expire. Shortly after World War II, Manhattan Project leader General Groves predicted a minimum 20-year American monopoly on nuclear weapons, a timeline that was accepted right up until the first Soviet test, 4 years and 3 weeks after Hiroshima. Throughout the war, The FBI had diligently screened and monitored Oppenheimer, his grad students, and other worrisome liberal scientists, all the while missing the two spies who actually were working at Los Alamos, machinist David Greenglass and the young German physicist Klaus Fuchs, who came over with the British team assigned to the project.
The truth is they were looking in the wrong direction. They were so busy worrying about this supposed nest of communists at Berkeley that they missed this quiet, Fuchs used to be called penny in the slot because he'd only speak if you asked him a question. Dropped a penny in the slot. So he was this very quintessentially quiet man. Everybody used him for a babysitter because he never seemed to have anything to do in the evenings, who was quietly collecting up the very blueprints for the bomb.
Teller immediately asked his former boss to endorse a crash program on the hydrogen bomb. Oppenheimer, now a key government advisor, told him to stay calm while all options were considered.
There was a huge fight back and forth between Teller and Oppenheimer. Teller saying we've got to build the hydrogen bomb or in 5 years I will be a prisoner of the Soviets in America. And Oppenheimer, who by then was head of the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission and in a position of great influence therefore, Oppenheimer thought that was insane and in so many words said so.
By this time, Dr. Teller also had friends in high places. Both the Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission were interested in the development of the hydrogen bomb, and powerful figures in both agencies were dismayed by Oppenheimer's casual dismissal of the project. Having found little support for a post-war superbomb program at Los Alamos, Teller lobbied for a new weapons laboratory in Livermore, California. Ultimately, President Truman agreed. The Soviet spy Klaus Fuchs had been present for the early discussions of the super, so it was assumed that the Soviets had that information as well. With America now committed to a crash program to develop the hydrogen bomb, it remained only to figure out how to make one work. Fission bombs use high explosives to compress uranium or plutonium into a supercritical mass, producing the pressures and temperatures that trigger hydrogen atoms to fuse into helium, carbon, and every other element. The trick lies in channeling those forces in order to trigger the fusion reaction before the whole mechanism blows itself apart. Dr. Teller and his team would have less than 10 millionths of a second to get it all working just right.
His design basically used an uncompressed tank of hydrogen with an atomic bomb attached to one end, sort of like a giant match, to light the tank of hydrogen, after which he thought it would burn by itself, like the stick of a match.
Teller's colleagues, Stanislaw Ulam and Enrico Fermi, undertook the mammoth task of proving Teller's design.
So they had to sit down and mathematically calculate in increments as small as they could do with the math they had, the progressive blooming of a thermonuclear fireball as these various physical processes went on.
In the pre-computer world of wartime Los Alamos, the calculations for the fission bomb were done with desktop adding machines. Something much faster and more sophisticated would be needed for the super.
They were able then to bring in the first large digital computer, as they called them in those days, the one that had been built by John von Neumann at Princeton.
The massive computer was immediately reassigned, even as a duplicate ENIAC was ordered for Los Alamos. Their version would be dubbed the Maniac. The very first problems assigned to the world's first digital computers were the calculations for the hydrogen bomb.
It looked less and less promising for the design, and he was really up a tree. He was in despair. We'd invested all that time, the country had invested all that time, and we still didn't have a hydrogen bomb to balance Joe 1 and the Soviet army on the ground in Europe. So he was really in very bad shape. And then Ulam figured that you could use the incredible energy from one fission explosion to set off another fission explosion in something that was physically attached. And it dawned on him one day that you could probably use this same process to set off the hydrogen.
Ulam conceived of a way to ignite hydrogen fusion and keep it burning. That was the easy part. Now he had to sell the idea to Dr. Teller.
Teller was skeptical for about 30 minutes, and then, brilliant man that he was, realized that this was the breakthrough Teller then immediately added that the real thing would be not to use the blast from a fission bomb, but the radiation. Teller knew, as very few people did then, that radiation at that scale, at that density coming off of a bomb, could actually compress matter. And then about a month later, he had another crucial idea, which was that if you stuck a stick of plutonium down through the middle of the hydrogen part of the bomb, then when it was maximally compressed, you would also have another fission explosion inside that would push out in the other direction, compressing the hydrogen from both sides, and then you'd really have a big bomb.
The rest, for the most part, was engineering. Less than 2 years after the decision to go forward, the first thermonuclear test device, dubbed Ivy Mike, was ready. In the South Pacific, an Ewitak atoll was selected to host the largest man-made explosion in history. Ivy Mike was a monster, a 2-story, 82-ton steel cylinder containing a concentric series of thermos bottles, which housed the super-chilled liquid deuterium, the hydrogen fuel, as well as raw uranium, tritium, Teller's plutonium spark plug, lead baffles, gold leaf reflectors, an ablative polyethylene lining, and, sitting at the very top of the assembly, a Nagasaki-style fission bomb to get it all going. The mechanism, along with its support and refrigeration gear, required a hangar-sized building called a shot cab to house it. The pipes leading off to the right were for observation purposes. They would carry the initial bomb light down a 2-mile wooden tunnel to sensors on a neighboring island, even as the tunnel was being vaporized by the blast.
Welcome aboard the USS Estes. You have a grandstand seat here to one of the most momentous events in the history of science. In less than a minute, you will see the most powerful explosion ever witnessed by human eyes. The blast will come out of the horizon just about there. And this is the significance of the moment. This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. If the reaction goes, we're in the thermonuclear era. For the sake of all of us, and for the sake of our country, I know that you join me in wishing this expedition well.
It is now 30 seconds to 0 time. Put on goggles or turn away. Do not remove goggles or face burst until 10 seconds after the first light.
The only thing missing was the inventor. Dismayed at having been passed over for the directorship of the project, Dr. Teller had gone home to Berkeley, leaving the Los Alamos team to prepare the test shot without his help.
I could not go. I had to stay in Livermore. But I had the seismograph set up and all seismologists in Berkeley watching.
The guys at Los Alamos thought that Teller walked out on the mic work because he thought that they were going to screw it up and he didn't want to have his name on it. But the fact that he was waiting in the basement in Berkeley for the seismic yield measurement to come through indicates that by then he knew it would probably work.
At 7:15 a.m. local time, a radio signal from the control room on board the cruiser Estes ordered the capacitors of the fission primary to simultaneously discharge into 92 detonators. The resulting shock waves raced through the high explosive shell, converging on and compressing the plutonium sphere into a supercritical metallic fluid, and crushing the tiny initiator at its core, releasing a few dozen neutrons to start the chain reaction. Million-degree X-rays outran the blast wave by milliseconds, racing down the radiation channels to immolate the interior plastic lining and send it crashing inward toward the plutonium spark plug suspended within the now superheating liquid deuterium. Pressure from the fissioning spark plug touched off a fusion reaction in the tritium at its core. The expanding shockwave met the inwardly rushing radiation to further compress the deuterium. Hydrogen atoms began to fuse, momentarily creating every element that had ever existed in the universe, and a couple more besides. A few millionths of a second after receiving its orders from the Estes, Mike had burst free of its thermos bottle and was heading for the upper stratosphere.
They were stunned by the size of the cloud. By the time it got up into the upper stratosphere, it spread out across 30 miles. So they watched this thing coming closer and closer. They were 30 miles out, and suddenly there's a cloud right over their heads. And that was shocking to them.
And precisely at the time when the shockwave should have arrived, it arrived and had roughly the right shape. At that time, I knew it was a success. Remarkably enough, but the people in Los Alamos did not know that.
It would be many hours before news from the South Pacific would make it through secure channels to Los Alamos. Teller immediately sent his old lab a telegram reading, "It's a boy." The yield of the fission bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was 13 kilotons, large enough to decimate Midtown Manhattan. Ivy Mike clocked in at more than 10 megatons, 10 million tons of TNT, enough to wipe out New York City and all 5 boroughs. But if the American monopoly on atomic bombs had lasted for years, the H-bomb gap would be measured in months. Soviet scientists Igor Kurchatov and Andrei Sakharov hadn't matched the Teller-Ulam two-stage design, but they had long since worked out a simpler way to supersize an atomic blast by including layers of deuterium and tritium within the high explosive shell. The result was the sloika, or layer cake, and not too long after Ivy Mike, they gave it a try. The layer cake super wasn't particularly novel. Edward Teller had once proposed a similar approach, which he called his alarm clock. Nor was it capable of yields much greater than a standard fission bomb, but it certainly had the desired impact in America.
If the communist bloc does attack, our radar sites and observers will sound the alert. Giant bombers will take to the air. Jet fighters will scream aloft.
General Curtis LeMay had commanded the B-29s that firebombed Japanese cities during the war. He used a similar approach when setting up the Strategic Air Command. Under his direction, SAC kept fleets of nuclear-armed bombers in the air 24 hours a day, ready to roar towards their target cities on a moment's notice. The battle plan called for simultaneous strikes on multiple targets, an attack designed to reduce the Soviet Union to rubble over the course of an afternoon. LeMay called it his Sunday punch. Strategic planners had another name for it, killing a nation. LeMay saw America's nuclear advantage as a short-lived resource, use it or lose it, and he wasn't alone. Aviation pioneer and war hero Jimmy Doolittle led a secret study that recommended giving the Soviets 2 years to come to terms, then attack if they failed to do so. President Eisenhower rejected the suggestion, though most of his electorate might have backed it. As citizens dug fallout shelters and learned to duck and cover, Washington politicians refused to accept the possibility that Stalin had built a first-rate nuclear program, so they began to search for the source of the leak. Fortunately, a convenient scapegoat was close at hand.
History again and again shows that we have no monopoly on ideas, but we do better with them than most other countries.
Robert Oppenheimer was a thorn in the side of newly appointed Atomic Energy Commission Chairman Lewis Strauss, long before he advised against a crash program on the H-bomb. The world-renowned scientist had enjoyed considerable influence in government circles for years, but his liberal views were far less welcome in the newly elected Republican administration. Strauss, backed by the Air Force and FBI, quickly made his move.
Lewis Strauss didn't know anything about physics, unfortunately. And he made the kind of mistakes imbued with this sort of savage right-wing political point of view that did indeed lead Oppenheimer to make cutting remarks to him. Oppenheimer could be a smartass. That was his problem. He was also, Strauss, a rather paranoid man, and he concluded that Oppenheimer was indeed a Soviet spy. And he clung to that idea until he was in a position of power, and then he used that to destroy Robert Oppenheimer.
Citing Oppenheimer's pre-war associations, as well as his refusal to endorse development of the H-bomb, Strauss convinced President Eisenhower to lift the scientist's security clearance. effectively cutting him off from any further government work.
Directed that pending a security review of the material in the file, a blank wall be placed between Dr. Oppenheimer and any secret data.
Humiliated, furious, Oppenheimer demanded a hearing. An AEC board was convened in April of 1954. Oppenheimer's lawyers were confident. They didn't know the prosecution was planning to call a surprise witness. The Soviet Union reacted to Ivy Mike by testing an H-bomb that required no supercooling or support apparatus. Teller's Livermore lab was working towards the same end. And if their first device turned out to be somewhat less than exciting, one of their later tests would shock the world. Castle Bravo was a breakthrough, a room temperature fusion weapon light enough to deliver by air. The lab predicted 5 megatons, but due to an oversight in their calculations, it topped out at more than 15 megatons. 1,200 times more powerful than the weapon that vaporized Hiroshima.
I think the Bravo one scared people because it didn't seem to want to stop. There's a story, and I've never heard quite who this was, that one of the scientists was suddenly so terrified that he dropped on all fours and crawled back up the beach because it looked to him like this thing was coming after him. Of course, the ships were positioned according to the expected yield. The exclusion zone was based on the expected yield, and a Japanese fishing boat, although Lewis Strauss, running the AEC, announced to the world that they were within the exclusion zone and may well have been a Soviet spy ship. In fact, these poor fishermen were well outside the exclusion zone. They were just fishing. But they got so much radioactivity falling down on them that several of them got ill.
Lewis Strauss had other concerns in the spring of 1954. Robert Oppenheimer had chosen to fight the suspension of his top-secret Q clearance. The hearing he requested became one of the most controversial incidents in a very dark time in America. The AEC hearing lasted 3 days. Most of his friends in the scientific community spoke on his behalf, but it was Oppenheimer's own testimony that set the tone for what followed. During the war, he had lied to the FBI about what seemed at the time to be a minor incident, and that lie was now coming home with a vengeance.
Unfortunately, Oppenheimer was approached during the war by a Soviet agent. Håkan Chevalier, a faculty member at Berkeley, asked him if he would consider sharing with our allies. Remember, the Soviet Union was Uncle Joe. They were our gallant Ivan fighting on the other front for us. Shouldn't we give them everything that we can? And if our government has decided they're not going to share this, perhaps we should do that privately. That was the nature of the offer. And Oppenheimer's instant response, by his own testimony, was, but that would be treason.
The matter might have ended there had Oppenheimer not waited months to report the incident as required. When he finally did so, he tried to minimize his friend's participation by suggesting that there had been approaches by several different spies. The result was the exact reverse of what he'd hoped for, creating the impression of a full-blown espionage ring. When asked on the stand why he did this, Oppenheimer could only reply, "Because I was an idiot." Despite the damage, Oppenheimer still expected to be cleared, just as he'd been 10 years earlier. By most accounts, it was the testimony of his friend Edward Teller that sealed the case. Asked if Oppenheimer's clearance should be restored, Teller said he would prefer to see the vital interests of the country in hands he understood better and therefore trusted more.
I was prepared to say Oppenheimer is a loyal citizen. I did say that. But that I did not agree with Oppenheimer in many details of what he was doing.
The consequences were devastating. Oppenheimer, his security clearance now permanently rescinded, would never advise on atomic policy again.
They locked him out. They told him he was irrelevant. They told him what was inside his head was of no value. It was a diabolically clever punishment that Strauss invented for Robert Oppenheimer.
As great as the impact was on Oppenheimer's life, Edward Teller was no less affected. Much of the scientific community considered his testimony a stark betrayal and turned their backs on him, many for the rest of his life.
Edward Teller was perhaps my best friend, but I must say I don't really understand him. I think the outcome, as far as people's getting angry at me, might have been a little more gentle.
After 30 years in power, Joseph Stalin was dead. Yet despite new Soviet leadership, the Cold War continued to escalate. Curtis LeMay's Sunday Punch was now official policy, as fears of a communist sneak attack reached epic heights. England and France were developing their own nuclear weapons, as was China, not on great terms with anybody at that moment. The era of maximum risk had arrived.
Once it was discovered how to release the huge energies that are involved when matter converts into energy, the bomb was inescapable. And indeed, every country that has tried to build an atomic bomb has succeeded on the first try.
By the early 1960s, nuclear weapons had become the first and last lines of defense. Weapons development and deployment accounted for nearly 10% of the gross national product in both the United States and the Soviet Union, as the two nations stuffed their arsenals with ordnance both large and small, including a miniaturized version of the Hiroshima weapon that could be fired from a cannon. Now armed with nuclear-tipped missiles that couldn't be recalled once fired, each side had the power to completely destroy the other, though at an unconscionable price. It was an age of paranoia on both home fronts. The largest weapon the United States tested hit an unintentional 15 megatons. The Soviets quite intentionally topped it.
They detonated a 60 megaton bomb. This thing would have had a fireball maybe 10 miles across, a fireball, and must have destroyed hundreds and hundreds of miles of Siberia where it was tested by dropping it from a plane. I asked the Soviets why they did that, and they said, we just wanted to send a message that you could. And that's the dirty little secret of all those tests that we did in all those years. They were in part a communication systems back and forth between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Strategic plans changed again, from containment to a policy known as MAD, for mutually assured destruction. The standoff was too belligerent to go on, so it didn't. Instead, it ramped up to DEFCON 2, imminent war, in October of 1962, when an American spy plane photographed Soviet nuclear weapons being readied for launch in Cuba, 90 miles off the Florida coast. As advisors fought over the appropriate response, Curtis LeMay and others were pushing for a full invasion of Cuba. President Kennedy went public with a live television broadcast and ensured that no North American citizen would get very much sleep over the next few days.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
At the height of this confrontation, the Strategic Air Command ordered those bombers to leave their orbits and fly toward the Soviet Union, The point was to engage Soviet radar and make it abundantly clear to the Russians that we were prepared to drop about 8,000 megatons of nuclear weapons on their country.
Behind the scenes, negotiations between the Kennedys and Premier Khrushchev diffused the crisis. And after 13 days of unrelenting pressure, the Soviet missiles were withdrawn. General LeMay fumed that a golden opportunity to crush the Soviets had been squandered, an opinion he would hold for the rest of his life. But the Cuban Missile Crisis had shocked the world. It was time to step back from the abyss. A hotline was set up between the White House and the Kremlin. Treaties were signed curtailing atmospheric nuclear tests. The Cold War was slowly beginning to thaw, a process that would require an additional 27 years and would not be without further incident. By this time, Edward Teller had become an advocate of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, not only in power plants, but also in the form of bombs that could be used for mining or to build new harbors. The program was called Operation Plowshare. Many offshoot projects were developed, including a nuclear-powered bomber that would not need refueling but was far too hazardous to fly. But there was one remarkable program that received funding for years, as a small group of physicists pursued a dream of using nuclear weapons to carry humanity to the stars. Their motto was Saturn by 70. But unlike NASA's engineers, the physicists behind Project Orion fully intended to don spacesuits and fly these missions themselves.
Oh yes, we were really space cadets and ready to go anytime.
Orion would eject nuclear weapons in flight. The explosions would impact a shock-absorbing pressure plate, accelerating the vehicle to interplanetary speeds. The theory was tested using chemical explosives. All that was needed for the full-scale version was a ready supply of leftover nuclear weapons.
You carried a couple of thousand per mission, so in fact it would have been a very good way of getting rid of the stockpile.
The war we didn't fight has shaped our lives, culture, and technology for more than half a century. The devastating outcome of a nuclear war called for a decentralized communications network large enough to recover after an attack. Today, we call it the Internet. The computer on your desk exists because one was needed to help design the H-bomb, and another, much smaller, was required to guide the resulting missile to its target. Society abounds with technology built to serve the worst of human impulses. And yet, the 20th century will also be remembered for the way so much of that technology was put to far better use. One of the many paradoxes of the nuclear age and of the legacy of Edward Teller.
I mean, it's both the inspirational Teller's legacy and a warning. And the warning is listen a bit more than he did. He could have nuanced his devotion to the wonderful things that could be done with overwhelming power, but he didn't nuance it enough, and so the warning is real and lasting.
Dr. Teller believed to the end of his life that the development and use of nuclear weapons by the United States made their subsequent use unthinkable, and so far at least, history has validated his opinion. In the more than 60 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no other nation has triggered a nuclear detonation on enemy soil. As tools of war, nuclear weapons have been obsolete since their very first use. The legacy of Edward Teller is still being written, but if luck holds, the one thing he will always be known for, the hydrogen bomb, will take its place in history exactly as he intended, as the first weapon of war that truly lived up to its promise. A weapon so terrible, it was never used.